Hello and welcome. This is your host Shubhangi Sharma. Exactly 2 years ago, India assumed the presidency of the G20 forum, taking over from Indonesia and marking the beginning of a memorable and impactful year for the G20. So initiatives like the IMEC, the inclusion of the African Union, the sharing of India's stag, and its push for sustainable development and institutional reform, India not only positioned itself as the voice of the global south, but also showcased its arrival on the world stage as a change maker in international governance. In fact, India has become a leading agent of change in all multilateral forums, from the United Nations to the more dynamic G20 and BRICS. To discuss this very phenomenon, I have with me today Sunaina Kumar, a senior fellow at ORF and executive director at Think 20 India Secretariat. Sunaina, so good to have you here.
Hi, Shubhangi. Really good to be here and thanks for inviting me.
So let's start with India's G20 leadership. What sort of impact do you think it left on the G20 platform, and what can the West learn from it?
So, I think a few things happened, of course. One was very much the optics of it, right? It is really with the G20 presidency that India could announce itself as a major global power. In the most obvious way, it used the opportunity that the G20 brought to expand its global influence, but it also did a few things that were unique, which other presidencies have not done. The first, of course, was the fact that it was the people's G20. India took it to the streets and managed to make foreign policy accessible to everyone. And that I think is a very unique thing to have done. We now have conversations which you hear commonly across the country about India's role as a leading power, how its status needs to change. This was not something that was happening earlier. Foreign policy conversations were always restricted to certain people, certain spaces, and I think that is one big shift, making it accessible, taking it to everyone. Another very important thing that India did was, of course, use the G20 to claim the mantle of global South leadership. And it did it by positioning itself as a partner to the global South by advocating for more inclusive international systems. And of course, also finding through the G20, finding ways to make that work in very with substantial outcomes, which of course is the inclusion of the African Union as well. And the third part that I would say that India did, which was again fairly unique to its presidency, was that it managed to weave in its own domestic priorities into this, which doesn't really happen, right? The G20 is an economic forum. Other countries have not done it as much as India has managed to do it, whether it is India's own priorities on climate policy, on energy transitions, through initiatives like the International Biofuels Alliance, Mission Life, technology, digital public infrastructure. All of these are things that are important for India's own growth story. All of these also became important for India's G20 presidency. So I think these were fairly unique. And of course, we see the impact of that 2 years on. I think that we can say that no other country has been as ambitious about using the G20 platform to promote its own international as well as domestic agendas. India is more confident on the global stage. We put that to good use. We continue doing that.
Absolutely. So, do you think this is sort of a template for other global South nations and for the West? How they can lead G20, they can always take notes from India. What do you say about that?
So I would say, I mean, a thing like G20 is also defined very much by the presidency and the Troika. And of course, the Troika, which is currently in place, which includes Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now South Africa, which has taken over, has ensured that there is continuity, has ensured that the advocating for the global South continues. Brazil did it after India, and South Africa will do it even more as the first African nation to really lead a major global forum. Issues that are important to the global South are on the table. Issues like inequality, hunger, climate change, technological inclusion, greater representation of the global south. And all of this will continue getting a push. But the G20 presidency will be passing on to the United States in 2026, and I think that is anyone's guess on how that will shape up to be, because of course, even in the United States, we've seen a regime change.
Absolutely. So, uh, from Indonesia to Brazil, from Indonesia to India, and then to Brazil, and now to South Africa. You mentioned how they have, this they have kind of delivered on this continuity. How do you think that will define the space for the US? Because I'm sure the US will have to follow a little bit on the footsteps of these global south nations, because they have defined, in fact they've brought the word global south to the center of all affairs here related to G20. So how do you think the US will they really be able to reconcile Western and global South interests and define how G20 is done thereon?
I think that definitely the US cannot isolate its presidency from what we're seeing in the world around us now. Even in the 2 years since India would have assumed its presidency, we've seen some changes, and some very definite changes come in the world. The state of churn continues, and certain trends which were already there have intensified, right? The world is a more chaotic place. When India had taken over the presidency, the Ukraine conflict was about a year old or less. The conflict in the Middle East had not even started. And we see it spiraling now. So that geopolitical rivalries and divisions are now getting only more intensified in the world. It's also been a year of elections, very definite elections in India, in the US, and all of these elections will also have an impact on the world order. I think what India did was also leverage these changes well for itself, use its position as a rising power, as a major economy, the fastest growing economy, and as a bridge between the global north and south. But to really answer your question about how the voice of the global south cannot, it is now here, and I think that is a demand that's only going to increase and become more of a rallying call.
So, you have written in one of your articles that Western institutions are being challenged by the global South today. So, how do you think such a sentiment of challenging the Western-led institutions is taking root in the global South? What role do the UN, the G7, or the lack of representation in the UNSC play in stirring disillusionment in the global South about Western leadership?
So I think there are certain converging trends that have really brought us to this moment of disillusionment or discontent from the global south. The first is, of course, the interconnected crisis, which started with this decade with the COVID-19 pandemic, escalating regional conflicts in the world, and of course the climate crisis. And all of these have had a greater impact on developing countries. We see widening inequality, we see developing countries in debt traps, we see the income gap between emerging and advanced countries only widening. So that the crisis is one part. The second, of course, is the growing geopolitical tensions, the fragmentation of the international order. So many reasons. There's a weakening Europe, an increasingly isolationist United States, a rising China, and all of this has created space also for the global south to ask for their own independent space, and also to demand more, a more just world, a more just international order, right? And that begins with looking at more institutional space for countries of the global south, which really multilateral institutions have been tilted towards Western countries. And the global south has united, given all these changes that have taken place over just the last few years. And the global south is saying that they want greater representation. They also want better financing for sustainable development, for climate and energy transitions. They are asking for reform of multilateral development banks. And all of this also explains why the buzz and all the conversation around even a grouping like BRICS is growing.
Perfect. That was really well said, very well put. So you just brought up BRICS, and I'd also like to bring in India here. What is India's role in sort of throwing that challenge, and is it really a challenge or a much needed guiding light in shaping the future together? Because I think that was needed for the West.
So I think India is actually doing a balancing job here, right? It is how is it challenging the current prevalent discourse? It definitely is challenging the discourse, right? But it has taken a few key approaches which are very distinct to India. I think one of them would be how it is positioning itself as a development partner. It is building trust based partnerships. And especially with countries of the global south, India, of course, the messaging is that we have shared solidarity, we have a shared colonial past, and that we understand the conventional north-south discourse, and also the fact that we are not looking at donor-driven approaches when it comes to building partnerships with the developing world, the way the global north has done. We are saying that we understand what your demands are, we have similar ones, so how do we share the learnings with each other, and how do we build these partnerships? So that's one. I think another, of course, is along with countries like Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, just demanding more inclusive international systems, what we were just talking about, more representation, putting issues that are important to the global south on the table of these institutions, whether it is sustainable development, whether it is debt, it is climate, it is the reform of MDBs. That's one. And another thing that is again unique to India in this whole sort of positioning itself as a global South leader, but also challenging the discourse, is that India is a bridge between the global north and south, right? It is not straddling any one world. It is the bridge between emerging economies like Brazil and South Africa, but it is also part of groupings like the Quad, which makes it a very natural partner and ally to countries like the United States, Japan, Australia. And so it is an intermediary, right? One that says that I understand the challenges of the global north, but I also can reach out to influential partners in the global south. And finally, I would say that another thing that India has done in all of this is that it's also reached out to countries which may not be part of multilateral groupings which are influential, so that something like the Voice of the Global South Summit, which brings together more than 100 countries, which was launched by India under its G20 presidency, is very much part of that outreach of saying, okay, so many countries of the world are not part of BRICS or G20, but their voice and their priorities need to be part of the international systems. And the inclusion of the African Union is one more such example.
Absolutely. So that really brings us to an interesting place. Basically, India, with the voice of the being the voice of the global South, with the global voice of the global South summit, which included more than 100 nations. It really seems like that was a great masterstroke on the Indian part, because before going into the G20 summit, it made sure that it spoke to all these nations and exchanged notes with them, discussed their priorities also, and brought all that to the G20 forum. Um, this is the type of leadership that shows that India has really arrived on the world stage in terms of international governance, because it's taking a whole lot of countries together, and wherever it goes, it remembers the voices of those who are not represented. So let's talk about, a little bit on the situation in the United Nations, where there is a strong lack of reform. And since we're talking about international governance, we cannot just overlook the United Nations, where India does not have representation in the permanent council of the security members, the UNSC. So tell me a little bit about that, how the UN has really played a role in allowing G20 and BRICS to take a lot of its space that it previously held on its own.
I wouldn't quite say that the United Nations has allowed it. I think the very fact that we are seeing more flexible partnerships, we're looking at mini-lateral groupings come up in different parts of the world, which are outside of the dominant global institutions from the last century, is very much a function of where the world finds itself now. And I think increasingly India's position has been defined by saying that we question and we challenge even some of the norms that are part of the United Nations, and yet we also think that the United Nations has its role in the world as an organization that really does bring together the world, the legacy and the history that it has, and so that the reform is what we are asking for. We are not saying that we will be creating alternate institutions and not be working with the prevalent ones, but saying that the reform has to come from within. And I think there's a very clear nuance in that which has to be appreciated.
Absolutely. So this brings us to the new American presidency. Donald Trump, during his first term as president, had really kind of spoken out against the United Nations in a big way. Um, so we're not sure what sort of respect he's going to have for the UN when he takes over. My question to you is really, how can India play a role in sort of reconciling these differences and making sure that the global community, benefits even from a Trump presidency, given the likelihood of strong chemistry in play between PM Modi and Trump, India being the voice of the global South, Trump just focusing on his MAGA regime at this point. Can they come together, find a middle ground, and impact global governance together?
So, how can we not bring in the question of the American election, Shubhangi, of course? Well, I think we will see the world order shift even more. It was expected. We can expect the United States perhaps to become more isolationist in its stand. The America First strategy taking hold. Of course, it's quite likely that they will change their stance on very long-standing international agreements like the NATO, the Paris Climate Agreement. Certain things are already, we're seeing trade war with China is intensifying. So in all this, I think India's strength has been in maintaining its neutrality and a pursuit of self-interest, which it's had from its independence in our foreign policy, and it served us well. I think another thing is that the current Indian regime has actually worked with three presidents in the United States already, including with President Trump. So we actually see no signs of nervousness in the Indian state about this change at all, which is very heartening because we see it in all other parts of the world. Uh, and I think one of the things that India is banking on is the fact that the United States too will need global partners. They cannot go it alone. And India is presenting itself as a trusted partner. That is the political backdrop of all of this. Of course, there could be economic repercussions, and that I think is something that presents both a risk and an opportunity. The risk, of course, is rising protectionism, higher tariffs will impact trade, or may impact FDI inflows into India. May, and we do not know yet. It's all wait and watch. But on the other hand, there is quite a chance that India can be a beneficiary of the China plus one strategy when it comes to moving supply chains away. So I think the US moment is one of wait and watch, but it seems that we are well prepared.
Absolutely. So, final remarks on India's role when it comes to international governance. What do you think India is going to bring to the table going forward?
I think India is definitely a more confident country on the world stage. And there are certain shifts in Indian foreign policy that we have seen over the last couple of years. India's confidently launching global initiatives, whether on climate, on green energy, on disaster resilience. It is setting norms on technology. And of course, it is positioning itself as a global South leader and also a country that is part of new alliances and partnerships in multilateral organizations, but also bilaterally, minilaterally. And I think all of those things will continue to be, along with the fact that we do have the fastest growing economy in the world. We are the world's most populous nation, and we are also right now in a sweet spot of being a partner to the global north and south. So I think that way we are in a good place, but the world keeps changing. So
Absolutely. The world does keep changing, but as you have really, put in as many words, India is more confident. It is not nervous about the new American government. In fact, India is in a sweet spot, and so it can really bridge the differences between the global South and the global North. I think moving forward, its role in international governance is only going to expand and become more impactful. I think the G20 was just the start of something really big. So, this was our conversation with Observer Research Foundation's Sunaina Kumar. Thank you so much again. Interesting, enlightening, and inspiring as always. Sunaina, thank you for your time.
thank you, Shubhangi. This has been a real pleasure.